In this lesson, we are going to learn how to factor trinomials in the form of ax squared, where a is 1, 1x squared plus something, I call that bx, plus another constant term, which I call c. So we're going to learn how to factor these trinomials. In previous lessons, you learned how to expand binomials by multiplying them out. So if I had x plus 3 and x plus 4, you learned that you could FOIL, or first x squared outer plus 4x inner plus 3x last is plus 12. And then those middle terms, the outer and the inner products, you could collect like terms. The first, the x times x, has no like term, and the last, the 3 times 4, has no like term. So where does the x squared come from? It comes from the first times the first. Where does the 12 come from? It comes from the last times the last. And the 7x, which is usually the part that people struggle with, is always the sum of the outer product plus the inner product. And so if I want to work backwards, and if I'm given this product and I want to find out what it factors into, then I work backwards and I have to kind of guess and check. The easy thing to know about guessing and checking is the first, x squared, comes from two things that multiply to give x squared, which in this case I only have one option, x times x. And the 12 comes from either, maybe it could be 1 times 12, it could be 2 times 6, or it could be 3 times 4. There's lots of options. But I know which one it is because I know the outer product plus the inner product has to add to give 7. And since I just did that question, we now know it has to be 3 and 4, because when I multiply the 3, I get 3x. When I multiply the 4, I get 4x. Therefore, they add to 7x. They're both positive. Since that's a positive 12, these signs have to be the same. They're both positive. And then that also adds up to positive 7x. Let's try another. So again, the x squared comes from x times x. So I'm going to just split that up. Now the 8 has options. It could be 1 and 8, or it could be 2 and 4. So which one of those would get me to 9? Well, if I put the 2 and 4, I get 2x and 4x. That would add to 6x. That's not correct. I need 9x. So it has to be the positive 1 and positive 8. Again, it's a positive 8, so it's either 1 times 8 or it's negative 1 times negative 8. Since it adds to positive 9, it has to be positive 1 times positive 8. And you can see if I was to FOIL this out, x times x plus 8x plus 1x plus 8, collect like terms, we would get our original question. But since I'm just asking you to factor, not expand and simplify, you would leave it in your factored form. Let's try another one. X squared gets split into x and x. 18, well, I got lots of choices again. 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. Which one of those is going to get me to negative 9? Oh, this time it's negative 9. Since that's negative, I know the outer and the inner have to add to a negative. And since both of them have to be the same, since it's positive 18, they're either both positive or both negative. So since that's negative, they have to both be negative. So I can see that negative 3 and negative 6 is going to get me to negative 9. And the order doesn't matter. I could put negative 6 first and negative 3 second. It doesn't matter. The order doesn't matter. I just know if I was to expand and simplify, I'd get back to that question. All right, let's go on to this one here. Same thing. X squared gets split into x and x. This time it's 20y squared. So now we need to find two numbers that multiply to give 20y squared. Well, since it's y squared, the same as the x squared, it just gets split into y times y. So I know that the two numbers could be 1y and 20y. It could be 2y and 10y, 4y, or 5y. And so which one of those gets me to positive 9? Again, it's positive, so it's either positive, positive, or negative, negative. Since it's positive 9, they both have to be positive. I can see those are going to add to 9y. But where does the x come from? That's why people are like, well, where does this x come from? Well, when I put my 4y and my 5y in there, when I go to FOIL it, again, the first times the first gets me the x squared, the last times the last gets me the 20y squared. It's the outer x times 5y and the inner 4y times x. Order doesn't matter when you multiply, so write them in the order of the alphabet. Oh, that's where the 9xy comes from. It's the outer plus the inner. That's where it comes from, but you just have to split the y up for the last times last. Okay? Now, all of those questions, my last number, which I like to call C, was positive every time. What happens when my last number is not positive? What happens when it's negative? Well, let's try this one out. X squared gets split into x times x. And now I need to find numbers that multiply to give 8. 1 and 8, 2 and 4. This time, since it's negative, either my 1's going to be negative and my 8's positive, or vice versa. Or again, my 2 is negative and that is positive. You can see if I make the smaller number negative, when I add them together, I would get a positive, wouldn't I? But I know they're adding to give a negative. So I'm not going to make the smaller number negative. I'm going to make the bigger number negative. By making the bigger number negative, I know that when I add them, I get a negative. Which one of those adds to negative 2? Because the outer and the inner will end up just adding those together because you're just collecting like terms, right? 5 and 4, you just added to get 9. They multiplied to get the 20, but they collect like terms. They add to give the 9. So I'm finding numbers that multiply to give this and add to give this. And I find that it's 2 and negative 4. So you just put your 2 in and your negative 4 in. Let's try this one. X squared gets split. 10 could be 1, 10, or 2, 5. This time, again, since the 10 is negative, one of those has to be negative and one has to be positive. Since this time they're adding to a positive, I'm going to put the negative with the smaller number. So when I add them together, I would get a positive. This is the sum, right, of those two numbers. And here I get 3. Which one gives me 9? Oh, this one gives me 9, so it's going to be a negative 1 and a positive 10, or positive 10, negative 1. And again, I could put a y squared at the end. It's all the same thing. I take my x squared and I split it up into x times x. And instead of writing the y out every time, I'm just going to split the y up down here. And I'm going to find two numbers that multiply to give negative 15. It could be 3 and 5, or 1 and 15. And since it adds to a negative, the bigger number gets the negative. And which one adds to negative 2? Oh, it's 3 and negative 5. So it's positive 3 and negative 5. You just write the negative as a subtract 5. Because when you multiply, it becomes positive times negative. That would get me negative 5y. That would get me positive negative 5xy. And that would get me positive 3xy. And when you collect like terms, you get negative 2xy. This one over here has an x to the power of 4. Instead of an x to the power of 2. Well, if it's an x to the power of 4, this time I would break it up into x squared times x squared. So that means when I do my outer and inner, I'm going to get a number multiplied by x squared. So I'm going to get something like 2x squared and 5x squared. And so that's where that x squared term in the middle comes from. If it was x to the 6th, I'd break it into x cubed, and then I'd have an x cubed in the middle. If it was x to the 8th, I'd break it into x to the 4, and that's where I get an x to the 4 in the middle, etc. If this is even, this would be half of that even number, right? All right, so again, 24, two numbers that multiply. Since again it's negative, one of them's going to be negative. Since this adds to a negative, the bigger number is going to become negative. I can see it's 2, so rather than listing all the numbers, I'm just going to find two numbers that are 2 apart, and the bigger number gets the negative. And you can get faster and faster at this, rather than listing all the numbers. Okay, and then you can always just double check. That gives me positive 4x squared, that gives me negative, oh yes, that adds to that. So you can always double check. Sometimes the order could be different as well. You'll notice that the order here is the x squared's at the back and the 4 is at the front. That's okay. When I go to write this out, I just split the x squared into the back. Right? And you can put that back there. Again, it's negative. So my two numbers that multiply to give 4 have to have different signs, okay? Because I want to be able to get a negative x squared. I want one of them to be plus and one of them to be minus. So I want this to be a negative. I could rearrange the order. There's lots of different ways of doing this. I'm just going to give you an example how you could just guess and check. Throw some numbers in, FOIL them out, see if it works. So I'm going to think, okay, what about 4 and 1? And since I want it to be a negative, I want 4 to be negative. So if I want to multiply and get 4 to be negative, I have to put the 4 here. Do you see why? 4 multiplied by negative x is going to get me negative 4x. And then I'm going to put the 1 here because that's going to give me positive 1. So if I was to FOIL this out, I would get 4 times 1, minus 4x, plus x, minus x squared, collect like terms, 4 minus 3x, oh yes, there we go. So you just do a little bit of guessing and checking, just knowing that, oh, if that's negative, they have to be opposite signs. I want to get to negative 3. What numbers could I put in the front to get me to negative 3? And you just kind of plug things in, and the more you practice, the better you get. Sometimes you may need to have to factor out a GCF first, because you can see your leading coefficient here is not a 1. You can't use this method unless this leading coefficient is a 1. It's the only, you can't just find two numbers that multiply to give 18 and add to give 12. It wouldn't work. So I have to factor the 2 out, if possible. Factoring it out, you divide it out of each term, right? And you put the quotient in here. So you would get x squared minus 6, y. Sorry, I'm messing up. I'm only dividing out a 6. Here we go. Let's try that again. Minus 6xy plus 9y squared. The 2 is now one of your factors. It just stays there. Now we see this as a trinomial that we could possibly factor. So now we're going to take this x squared and split it into x times x. And we're going to find two numbers that multiply to give 9 and add to give 6. Since it's positive 9, then it's either positive or negative, but I see it's negative 6, so I know they both have to be negative. I see it's negative 3 and negative 3. So I'm just going to put them in like that. Don't forget your y at the end, right? You notice that the x minus 3y are the same. So if they're both the same, you're allowed to rewrite it like this. Instead of writing x minus 3y twice, you just put a little squared there. Okay? Same thing over here. Factor out my 3, but I also notice there's an x, so I have to factor out the x as well. So I get x squared minus 7x, and I'm running out of time here. I only have another 30 seconds. So we would continue on here, plus 10, and we would bring the 3x down, and we're going to get minus 5 and minus 2. So in general, to factor x squared plus bx plus c, you find the two numbers that multiply to give c and add to give b. And that is how you factor if your leading coefficient is a 1. It must be a 1. Okay? And again, it could be unfair.